So with that, I would definitely like to open up the floor for discussion, questions, different things that you guys may want to talk about as a whole.
I'm going to mute myself. Joey, thank you very much. You raised really a lot of interesting aspects about what education should be about and how we do or do not pursue it as an academic institution. So I think that is pretty good. Christina, do you have any comments before I pull some questions out of the Q&A?
Yeah, so I think my really first comment or question has to do with what do, I want to ask this in a way that doesn't sound facile. What do you do in a given day as a turfgrass science? Like what is your day like? You wake up in the morning, what do you do?
If you're the person managing a high-end facility, there's probably a lot of, I just saw somebody actually post something on a social media site about this, but the first thing they did was check the weather, because it's going to be really critical to figure out what the day is going to be like. Check, maybe irrigation, make sure that everything ran, because nowadays everything is very technologically, you can probably look at your phone and see what did or didn't happen. Of course, mowing is a critical part of managing any turf grass. So that ends up being an incredible part of the initial day whenever you go to a golf course or an athletic field. And then beyond that, and then you just kind of look, I really talked about the little nuances. Like whenever you start to really get in tune to exactly the way things should look, you see the smallest minute things that are not just right. And so that attention to detail that you end up picking up if you work in this industry for a while, it just starts to become obvious. And then you can kind of note like things that have to be done or things that should be improved and so on and so forth.
Interesting.
Hey, Joey, yeah, one of the things I've often thought about in terms of doing research, whether it's applied or basic, and Christina, you in terms of what your company is trying to do with education, is in reality, we're the same as doing cooking, as doing a cook, because if you can't pay attention to that detail, you can't do research or figure out problems. I mean, we can give everybody the same recipe and it never comes out the same because people just aren't paying attention to the details.
That's totally
I think
true.
I think that's a really good point. Christina, do you want to talk a little bit about what your company provides that that could be used to address some of the things that Dr. Young mentioned?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have, and I can provide a link to this in the chat as well. One of the things that we have is we call it a virtual unconference. And what we're trying to do is link, it's sort of like what y'all are doing with Science by the Glass, but we're trying to link science educators and science hobbyists with each other and with cool people who are doing cool things like science of turfgrass, which I didn't even know it existed. So beyond the use of the sensors in a classroom or at home, I think one thing that's really valuable for us is providing that community where we can learn about things. I'm a social scientist by training. You probably don't have any idea what a social scientist does in a given day. And I think building these communities of like, what does it look like to do science? It can look a lot of different ways, but we're all unified in this basic, like, it's a way of understanding the world. It's a way of answering questions about the world. So I'll drop a link in the chat to our virtual unconference. It is free, so anybody can join.
So we have a couple questions I'll answer. So here's the first one, is Joey, how do you inspire your own daughters to get excited about your field?
I don't know. I saw that question in there. It's probably a little tricky because our oldest child is 4. Maybe it's tricky or maybe it's easier. I think if you're a parent of small kids, you know that your kids kind of probably just look up to you and know all the things that you do. So in that way, it's probably easy. I just do what I do. But at the same time, I do feel like it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. Maybe to a fault to some extent. I again might pick out things or notice things that other people wouldn't. And so I think in that regards, everything can be a little different. They did enjoy doing turf babies a lot. They had a lot of fun doing that for sure. They were able to help with holding a bag or putting the grass in a wet paper towel and that sort of thing. So that was, they did enjoy the little aspects of that. And I'm hopeful that some of the passion that I have now for science will rub off on them as they get older.
So having two older daughters, I would take them to Big Bend with me to do the field work down there. And after a couple of trips, they both said to me, "Dad, you work far too hard. It's too hot. I don't like this." But now that they're in their early 30s, they've come around. It's taken them a decade to come around to understand the importance of doing that. So, yeah. The other question, this is for Christina. Do kids get excited more easily about STEM education when they have access to gadgets like the ones Pocket Lab provides?
Yeah, I actually think that's an amazing question. It really goes with what you were just talking about, Dr. Young, with the idea of getting your kids involved by having them make the turf babies themselves with the wet paper towels. There is consistent evidence that when kids are exposed to science through hands-on learning and through what we call like a learning cycle model, where they're exploring on their own and then revisiting concepts. So engaging them and then having them explore and then going back and explaining to them. There is evidence that this does improve both their learning outcomes, but more importantly, to me, I think the way they feel about science, those positive attitudes about science. So, yes, we have white papers on our gadgets and they do improve the way students feel about science, but it's not just our gadgets. Anything that gets kids or students in general in the driver's seat of science will improve their positive attitudes toward it.
And I can attest, my wife, Debbie, we had a nonprofit for Northridge Elementary School here in Lubbock, and we called it Northridge Zoo Crew. And so what we did is we set up 120 animals of different kinds in the school. And the students that went through this for the 20 years, they've come through tech, they're out and about, and they still remember that it's changing their attitude about what science really is.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, just letting students kind of do things with their hands and experience science.
So there's an interesting question, and this is appropriate, and I may comment on this also. We all know that there are large gaps between rural and urban STEM education. What are ways that we can close this disparity through traveling labs or tools like the ones from Pocket Lab?
Dr. Young, you want to start and then I'll jump in too?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yep. I can't say that I'm like overly familiar with the traveling labs other than us, starting to work on them. There's a number of those that have been developed through and by Sizer, I'm sure with inspiration from faculty across campus. But I think just the idea that, maybe those rural students who aren't capable of having as much hands-on interaction with some of the technology that may be relevant, the opportunity for that technology to be, brought to the students that are in that rural area, especially for us here in Lubbock, because we're surrounded by so much rural, nature and area, that it's a critical part of being able to deliver that hands-on education that can at least help give that spark that they're hopefully going to get.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's about getting the tools in kids' hands, whether this looks like just normal, like the kind of labs that we did when we were all kids, where like you could have a potato and grow like the plant out of potato. These are things that don't take a lot of money. I think a lot of times the kind of sensors and materials that science requires seem really overwhelming and really expensive. And the rural school districts, and honestly, even urban school districts in some areas, don't have the kind of funds that are needed to do those activities. So being able to find ways to make it affordable without losing any quality of education, whether that's with a potato or whether it's with our sensors, which are not as expensive as some other options. But, I think trying to get those labs into kids' hands without overburdening the school system. Dr. Zach, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there are two things I want to point out too from Texas Tech. We currently, as a group of about 12 faculty, have an NSF funded grant to actually address this disparity with rural. And so we bring a cohort of students into Texas Tech that have come to Tech to help them be successful. We're particularly targeting the rural students coming to Tech because it's hard for them to adjust to even living in Lubbock, given where they're coming from or their background. The other thing, and this is something, Christina, that you mentioned, we worked for 5 years with El Centro Community College in Dallas. And one of the things that we found is even though they're urban, those students are place bound to such a degree they don't have access to anything that we would expect even in Lubbock. And we ran a program where we take them to Junction for a couple of weekends to talk about field work. And the one comment that always came out is, we never knew anything like this could ever exist. Mm-hmm. And even with the Climate Science Center, we hold an intern program. We haven't done it the last couple of years because of COVID, but we bring about a dozen students, mostly rural, mostly first generation students from around the 4 states to visit all the universities for about 3 weeks to see what is possible. And once you show them those doors, anything is possible. Yep, very good. There are a couple more questions in the chat. Let me look at this, or Q&A. Let's see here. Okay, no, so we've answered some of them coming on now, but this goes back to both Christina and to Dr. Young. One of the challenges I think all STEM education has is trying to help the students nowadays. I think particularly if you're talking about high school students, about the applicability of what they're learning. And I think I see that more and more, even in biology, as students come in, because they want to be able to solve problems. But we don't necessarily train students to do applied research. So you guys want to comment on that?
You can go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because the connection between how to think about the world scientifically and then actually doing the science, and then what does that look like in a career or a job? It seems like those are really abstract. So I'm a social scientist, and I don't know if it's easier or harder for us to think about what social science is. One thing that I've found is in this experience of living in a COVID pandemic for 2 years, to really see how much more we as a community need to think about the role of social science, because anything that discusses behavior is social science. So if we ask, why do people get vaccinated? Well, that's a social science question. It's not a medical science question. So I don't know if this is even really answering your question, because I don't know if I have a good answer, but being able to identify where thinking scientifically helps us, even if it's not part of doing science ourselves or doing something for our careers, just knowing that being able to think about what science is and how it works helps us understand how we should react in a COVID pandemic. That's useful in itself, even if it isn't applying science.
But I think one of the things you hit, and as I've gotten more and more into my career, we teach the scientific method, but in actual fact, no one really uses it. It's a design, because it's easy to teach initially, but we ask questions, and anybody who asks questions to try to get where the truth lies or what you're trying to understand, that really is science in its basic form.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd say for me, I granted, again, I know that I'm in a very specialized field that there's plenty of basic research that occurs in turfgrass. There's no doubt about it. It's not something that I have an incredible amount of expertise to be able to do. And so my tendency, because of my expertise and my experience, is to gravitate towards applied studies, which is unique in that sense. But it's also, to me, driven an incredible opportunity to not only just work with graduate students that I have that come into my program that do research, but I've had the opportunity to work with high school students on science fair projects, and it's been a multi-year kind of thing. We've started from the time they were in the 9th grade, and they're graduating as seniors now, and just their their progression as a, not only as a person, but as a scientist, and, their passion for also like turfgrass as a whole has grown as they've began to understand more about the applicability of transferring things that maybe as an athlete you don't really think about, but now that they understand more about the science of it, they can comprehend different attributes or think about things in a different way.
So
Yeah, I think
Christina,
that's really interesting to think about your experience being very applied, and I think that's so important because a lot of times I think the researchers and the practitioners aren't talking.
So in my graduate students that are currently finishing up, they did all their dissertation work with actual producers, and their comment was there's no controls. And I said, when you're out in the real world, there are no controls. This is what they have to do to be able to do it. And so you have to understand what the dynamics are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it really has freaked them out because they're really realizing how one tries to actually solve problems. So Christina, this is for you. This is from Brittany. She says, as a woman in STEM, how do you think we can build community, grow our presence, and increase confidence for other women to enter STEM fields?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's International Women's Day. So good day to be asking it.
It is.
And so I wish I had a really easy answer that I could just like give a very quick answer and be like, there we go, all the problems will be solved. I really do think that this STEM education topic is key though, because I think just like what Dr. Young was saying in modeling this and starting early, and how do we get women and girls across the finish line to being science, in a lot of times in academia, we call it the leaky pipeline, where there are so many places along the way that girls fall out, whether it's being told that it's not cool to like math and science when you're in first grade, or whether it's like, not being encouraged to pursue higher level math in high school, or falling out when you get married or when you have a child. There are so many places that we're kind of failing our girls and women along the way. And I think each one of us can only find one of those places to plug the pipeline. So I think that's what I kind of like to think about and advise is find one place you can help plug the pipeline, whether it's the sixth graders you teach in your middle school classroom, or whether it's other women in your life that you encourage to get back in the workforce if they want to after they have kids. Find one place along the pipeline that you can materially make a difference, and then devote your energy to that rather than looking at the whole pipeline and being like, well, we're screwed, we'll never make it.
No, I think that is very
Another
good.
thing I would add, John, I know I'm not like directly can relate because I'm not a female in science or in again, my case in turfgrass science, but I think as an industry, there's been much greater effort to recognize those women that are in our industry. Many of them are doing amazing things. The person that manages the Baltimore Orioles baseball field is a female, and she's very much so. She's been in the industry for a long time, and I'm sure she's experienced all kinds of different turmoils and challenges and different things, but she's persevered through it. And so people like her last year and then this upcoming year at the US Open, the women's US Open, they had a completely full female staff. Their volunteers and everyone was female, and they're trying to do it again this year. So I actually had a student who was in my intro to turf class who was not a horticulture major, and after taking the class she decided she wanted to be a turf major, and so she's interning at a golf course in Montana right now, and I'm encouraging her to think about going and volunteering at the US Open. So I think as an industry that's male dominated and struggles with that inclusive nature, I think the industry as a whole, from the industry partners, the Syngentas and the Bayers and the big players in industry are doing a good job as well to promote the females that are in the industry that are successful and that are paving the way for females to come in the future.
And I think that raises a question as to how we show value to what people do, because one of the things that's going on in biology is the reverse of what we're seeing in other disciplines, where the males in the United States are no longer going into biological sciences. And that has decreased. Now, that's not necessarily, I mean, the number of people going in is up, but the males are going into business. They're not going into the biological sciences. And it's just curious how, you know, there are these gender shifts based on perception of success, really. And that's really what part of, I think, what we have to, what does it mean to have a successful career and to have you know, be happy in what you do?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when men perceive that a field is becoming female dominated, it can cause these exodus events where suddenly men are fleeing. You know, we see it in thinking about what are women dominated careers and what are men dominated careers. You know,
Yep.
do we see men fleeing fields that have historically been more male dominated? Probably. I think that's exactly what you're pointing to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think if you don't address that, we're really just repeating the cycle in a lot of different ways. Because I think I know the problem, I think we as humans, we do approach things in different ways as males and females, but in the same way we tend to attract different personality types to different kinds of efforts, we become more restrictive. We don't have the diversity. You know, that's what's happening in our politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think the same thing happens in education also in different ways.
Yeah, I think we have a tendency to become really siloed,
Yep.
whether it's in politics or in education or, you know, whatever it is, we want to silo ourselves by identity, whether that's our gender identity or our political identity. And I think it does have negative consequences. As a political scientist, I can say that with confidence.
That's right. Yeah, because it prevents us from having the full expression of the diversity of ideas that needs to be in play. And we have lost that to a lot of degree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think, you know, and one of the reasons why our climate center and the group we're a part of did not do interns for a couple of years is because the federal government decided it wasn't necessary, right? And they cut the funding for that. So we're in a process of trying to get it back to be able to do that because the impact that it has had. And so it's those small scale, I mean, 10 or 12 people is enough in a region to really start making a difference because it's simply exponential in terms of its impact.
Definitely. And I think it's really good to see that this event is still going strong. I attended a few when I lived in Lubbock, and it is great to see because I think the people who attend an event like this, those 10 or 12 people you're talking about, that's this group, you know, it doesn't matter how many people are attending. These are the people who are engaged.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Yes. Yeah. So we have a couple of minutes to sort of give last thoughts. And I have one as I've been thinking, and I'll start with Christina. If you have one thing you would like to see changed in academia, what would it be to address this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think trying to make sure we talk about what science is better. That's what I want to see happen. And that's why I'm working at a STEM education company now. I think we aren't doing a good job at explaining what science is. A lot of times, you know, I always thought science was the mitochondria as a powerhouse of the cell. And there we go. I did it. I did science. Really thinking about science as a process, because I think being able to think critically and literally, is that the word? Hopefully, about science helps us with everything, whether it's thinking critically about the gender pay gap and why it exists, or about COVID and what we should do. This kind of literacy is really key. And so I want us to see academia and K-12 education too change to be better understanding of what science truly is.
Joey?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm right in line with what you said, Christina. I think it's super important, again, for us to communicate and demonstrate what science is, and also to, again, help build a stronger connection to something that people have experience with. Sometimes science may seem like an abstract kind of thing that's maybe out there. Other people are doing science and it may affect me, but it's not something I'm going to actually be doing, where it's clearly something that, you know, people can be innately involved with.
And I would have to say, because of the fact that we represent 3 educational pathways, biology, plants, soil, and political science, the model of departments in the university, something that's antiquated.
Maybe, I do think that these cross-disciplinary ventures are really important. I think it's really good because I think, we get the people in the natural sciences who perceive that what social scientists are doing isn't real science. And then people in social science perceive that the natural sciences are lazy scientists because they don't really have to think as like, you get control variables. We don't. So I think being able to bridge that conversation and say, we're both doing science, we don't have to gatekeep science. Science is something that we can all do.
Dr. Young?
Yeah, those are excellent points. Yeah, I totally agree with all the things that you just said, without a doubt.
Yeah, my comment question is, ecologists ask the questions of the obvious, right? Why do ecology? Right?
The sky's blue, frogs come from tadpoles. What else do we need to know?
Exactly right. That's exactly right. So yes, a very great conversation, folks, and I appreciate the questions from the Q&A and those participating on our webinar today. Dr. Young, thank you much. Christina, thank you much. Hopefully get you back, and please join us. I know Randall will make sure you're added to our list to send the Science by the Glass out. So whether you're in California or in Australia, right, it just depends upon the time you can join us. So Randall, I'm going to